Hey everyone, good morning from chilly Colorado. It's a balmy 10 degrees today. I got some bad news. So for those of you who've been following me for a bit, you know that over the summer I recorded a video of the 5 technologies that I was most hopeful one for. The issue we're facing is that we're entering into a period of extreme capital dearth and a shortage of people in their 20s and their 30s. Well, the people in their 20s and their 30s are the folks who get together and imagine the future and develop the technology, and a lot of cheap capital is required to bring it to mass manufacture. And without those two factors, the pace of technological change that we've been used to seeing these last 20, 25 years is going to slow considerably. And that's before you consider any sort of general dislocations because of demographic aging or drops of consumption or breakdowns in globalization. So the pace is going to slow incredibly. And the question is which technologies are kind of already at the hump, where they're just right on the edge of mass manufacture and mass application. And one of the technologies that I identified was something called small modular nuclear reactors. The idea is you have a reactor that's small enough to fit on the back of a semi-trailer, and you can just plug it into any other power system. So if you've got a coal plant, for example, that you are looking to decommission, you can pull one of these in or 2 of these based on the size, up to 10, and just plug them in and they're good to go. And the 20% of electricity that the United States gets from nuclear currently could continue in perpetuity. Well, over the course of the last couple of weeks, the companies that were involved in building the prototype have abandoned the project. They say the numbers no longer make sense. They could get enough sponsors. So if this technology is going to continue, it's going to continue at a later time with different players in an environment of even sharper limitations on technological development and capital availability, which means it's probably not going to happen this decade at all. Which means the 20% of the electrical grid that is supplied by nuclear right now is going to fade away because, with a couple of exceptions, all of those reactors are older than I am, and I turn 50 very, very soon. So not only do we need to massively increase the amount of power generation we have to double the size of the industrial plant as the Chinese break apart, and we need even more power in order to do the green transition and maybe move to a more electric future, we also have to replace 20% of our total energy supply, which is at the moment all base load, which is something that wind and solar can't come up with or can't work with because they're too intermittent. So we just saw our overall challenge for the next decade become inordinately more difficult unless, of course, someone picks up this technology very, very soon. Sorry. All right, bye. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here coming to you from Seattle. It is late October, and this is one of those that can store, so you probably won't see it till November, but whatever. The topic I want to discuss today is strikes in Hollywood, of all places. We've got 2 separate strikes going on, one of which has at least temporarily been resolved, one involving the writers, which for the moment is behind us, they've settled, and one involving the actors. And the issue is honestly one of technology. With the advent of a sufficient processing power to allow streaming services over internet connections, we now have a number of major providers such as Hulu or Apple or Amazon or Netflix that are not just providing legacy shows, but new shows and transmitting them to their end users and consumers through a completely different network that doesn't use the normal TV radio approach, VHF, things like that. This means different models. It used to be that all the income came pretty much from advertising, and now there are different ways to do it with, say, a per-month subscription charge. You're going to see more and more and more in this going forward, so we have to split it in those 2 factions. So first, the labor that deals with the screenwriting, and then the labor that deals with the acting. So screenwriters. This is going to be an ongoing issue, largely because of the revenue play. When screenwriters used to produce things, whether it was for television or movies before, they'd work directly with the movie house, which would generate their income from either advertising or ticket sales. Now that you've got streaming, the question is what constitutes readership or viewership, because it's not the same model. And is it something that's a once and done? Is it something that gives them income over time? Because unless you're an A-lister where you can demand whatever terms you want, everyone else has to kind of suffer through. And for the writing, the rise of AI is providing more and more support for people who are particularly creative and leaving everyone else by the curb. But as problematic as that is from the point of view of the writers, it's a disaster for the actors. We already have technology that allows us to fill in the background with either a complete green screen generated system or even to a certain degree extras. And I think the two movies that have demonstrated how this technology is coming along the best, one is Ant-Man 2, the one where we had some characters who in today's world are in their 60s, but we had a couple of scenes where they were shown when they were in their 20s and their 30s, and you can use the technology to make people look younger. We've also had World War Z, which is a hot mess. Great book, horrible movie. But when you had the swarms of zombies, those weren't real zombies. They were all CGI generated. And we could see how they looked very, very real. Well, you play both of those movies forward because those are both 5 years old now. And we're getting to the point where you can film an extra from a number of different angles and insert them into the background just fine. And so part of the reason that the actors were striking is because they were being asked to sign documents to basically surrender their future digital rights. So you're an extra in this movie, you're filmed, and then they reserve the right to recreate you royalty-free in the future. And obviously, if you're a low-ranking actor or an extra or an aspiring actor, that pretty much ends your career. It won't really hurt the A-listers, but pretty much everybody else would be left in the cold. And very soon, we're going to be able to take footage from people who are dead and use AI technologies to put them into leading roles if we want to. And so the balance, the ability for you to profit off your skill set and your presence all of a sudden isn't there anymore, and it's a question of who generates the revenue. And at the moment, the law suggests it's the people who control the AI-driven software and actually design the movies in the first place. So from a writer's point of view, this is going to get a little bit stickier as we move forward, but it's going to be more of an evolutionary process. But for the actors, you're actually looking at the evisceration of an entire class of people. And that will take with it the way movies are produced. Because if you can just have a handful of A-listers and B-listers who are doing kind of a number of the main roles and have the star power to draw people, and everything else is computer generated and looks as real as the real thing, then we're in a fundamentally different model for everything. And we're probably going to be in that environment by the end of this decade. So one way or another, Tinseltown is going to look very, very, very different, and it's probably going to have a lot fewer people. Everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from central Colorado, about 12,500 feet, just below a fairly sizable snowfield on a mountain I was climbing. I figured this moment was the best time I could think of to talk about the Arctic. A lot of you have written in and wondering if we're on the verge of a new era of exploration and exploitation and development. Can't rule it out, but a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, the Arctic is, for the most part, completely unpopulated. And so even if you have a wonderful mineral resource, you then have to go into tundra in order to build roads or ports or airstrips. Tundra is not great land to deal with. In the summer, it tends to turn into a full-on swamp. So if you're going to have a town, it has to be elevated. And if you're going to have a road, it has to be on a raised berm that stretches hundreds, if not thousands of miles, which is why most of the remote places in Russia and Canada for mining aren't on the road network. You basically fly in, and then the place is just a frozen version of hell in the winter. If you want to do offshore, you're not just dealing with ice, you're dealing with moving sea ice, which means that most of what you have to do has to be under the ice, and yet it still has to be pumped back to the shore where it can be stored until the ice melts in the summer. So now you also need storage. So your cost for development for facilities up there is very high. The maintenance cost is extreme, and you're not going to be able to have a regular income stream because you can only ship out seasonally. Then there's the problem that where there are populations on the or above the Arctic Circle are very, very limited. You basically have two categorizations. The first is you've got the Russians, because during the Soviet period, the Soviets saw the entire Arctic zone as a zone for national security, and even though it made no economic sense, they settled people up there to the tune of a few million. Now, the vast majority of those people have found ways to get back to warmer climes, but there are still places like Murmansk and Norilsk that are way up there. The thing is, no one is going to sink the capital and technology that is necessary to develop the Russian Arctic. Exxon was doing a little bit on this in places like Murmansk and Vendré. I'm sure I mispronounced that. Sorry, Russians. and the Yamal Peninsula. But in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, that money's gone away. And there aren't a lot of companies on the planet that have any sort of experience in dealing with this sort of thing. The Russians do have some limited skills. Obviously, they've got plenty of experience. The problem is that the gutting of the Russian demographic structure is well underway, and the youngest people who were trained in the Soviet period with the full suite of technical skills necessary to do things like this, they're in their early 60s now. There just aren't enough people out there to do it, and the Russians have never had the capital to do it in any sort of scale. The other classification are places where the normal rules of the Arctic do not apply. There are a couple of places in the poles where warm water currents wash up against the coastline of the continent and make it a zone that is ice-free year-round. And the one that matters there the most is the North Atlantic drift going up to northwestern Europe. So the entirety of the Norwegian coast is ice-free year-round. And that's one of the reasons why Norway has become one of the world's preeminent energy powers, because they can go into the offshore oil and natural gas zones and produce year-round. They still have to deal with the depth. They still have to deal with offshore. They still have to deal with relatively light population densities. They still have to deal with storms. But at least they don't have to deal with moving sea ice. And as a first world country, they have capital access that the Russians simply can't match. The thing, however, though, is it's already ice-free. If you want anything more than what you've got right now, you've got to wait for the pole to melt out. And I have not seen a single estimate that suggests that the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free in the winter before the end of the century. Remember, the problem isn't just ice. It's seasonal ice that moves. And then the other issue is if you're not after resources, you might be after transport. The idea that you can ship things from Europe to East Asia back and forth much more easily than you can going the southern route through Suez or around Africa and India. Well, technically, there might be something to that. But again, seasonal sea ice, you have to wait for the place to be ice-free. Otherwise, all the aids to navigation have to be redropped and recharted every single season. So again, seasonal route. And even if you're relying on an icebreaker, that icebreaker is going to be Russian. And in the current environment, there aren't a lot of people who want to rely upon the Russians for safety in times when there's distress, because for several thousand miles of empty trackless ocean and ice, there is no one else you can call. Finally, if you're going to do this, you're connecting East Asia, the most rapidly aging part of the planet, with Western Europe, which is the second most rapidly aging part of the planet. So you're making a long-term bet on two regions that demographically are not going to be able to trade much at all for much longer because they simply don't have any consumption that is going to be sustainable in the long run. So I don't think without a series of technological breakthroughs that are not very likely, we're going to see a lot of development up there. Everyone will play. Everyone always plays. But this is one of those things at the top of the world that's just going to stay there. All right, that's it. Take care.